Right. Are we expecting more folks? Give them a couple more minutes, or are we ready to go?
Yeah, I would imagine that some more folks will be joining. So maybe a minute or two. I know folks are probably trying to figure out the app and where to click and jump in.
Okay,
Um,
sounds good. Thanks for being on time, Lupe and Sandra. I said your name correctly. Feel free to correct me.
Thank you.
We'll dig in just a minute. Hi, all. We're going to get started in just a minute. We were just people were transitioning. I think we were just giving them a little bit of time. I have 4 past the hour, so we'll give it just another minute and we'll go ahead and officially get started. Maybe as everybody's joining, if you want to share a little bit in the chat about yourself, feel free to introduce yourself. Maybe share a bit about where you're joining us from. I don't know if everybody's in California in the same area or if you're in a different part of the state or country. I know a lot of us work all over now. So maybe just introduce yourself there. And this will be highly interactive. So we're going to ask for you to participate quite a bit. So hopefully that is a good thing. And if you just want to share in the chat, thanks, Lupe. Thanks, Catherine. Hey, Veronica. Yeah, where are you calling in from? Okay, interesting. So different places. Cool. Yeah, and your school district is fun to share too.
That's the one workshop you can apply. Do you see that? Yes.
And I'm going to mute the background noise here. If you can keep the lines muted, we feel free to engage with the content and share ideas, stories, questions. We'll have some polling exercises as well. And so we'll make this super interactive. We want to hear from you and with you. So join in the chat. Tell us where you're joining us from. Oh, hey, I don't see your phone. Oh, Barb, joining G Pastorelli. I'm not sure your first name. Hey, Sandra. Thank you. Okay, cool. So share in the chat if you haven't yet. Farmersville. Hey, Raquel. Awesome. Well, my name is Julie Kratz, and I'm joining from Indiana. I had the chance to attend the After School Association's National Conference last year and got to meet some amazing folks. My background's a bit more on the corporate side, but as you can see, I've written books about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have my own speaking business and training business focused on workplace inclusion. But more commonly, we've realized the conversation needs to start earlier. That's why we do work with what we call little allies. So that's the session that you're attending today to learn more about how to foster inclusion from a young age. So for you all doing the work that you do with kiddos, such an important opportunity. What I want to share with you today are ideas, activities, questions you can ask, things you can say and do to demonstrate support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I do this work because I've got 3 kiddos of my own. And I realize they have a lot of advantages associated with being, neurotypical at this point in their life, not having a disability, identifying the same gender of which they were assigned at birth, being cisgender, certainly being white. But from a gender perspective, we've got a lot of work to do. We're a few centuries away from that equality existing, believe it or not. And so really my life's work is to help shorten that up, speed that up, because I want all places to be more inclusive for them. And you can probably just point to the news cycle and see other states, things that are happening to kind of push out the DEI message at the very time we need it the most. So that's what I feel compelled about. And I have some podcasts on the subject. Highly recommend the Inclusion School podcast. It's a passion project, so it's not something that we're necessarily monetizing at this point, but it's really more about, we interview educators, book authors, children's book authors, sorts of folks in this space. My friend Simone and I do that, and it's a real delight to get to share that work with our audience as well. So that's a bit about me, my background. Again, I've been doing this work for 8 years, so a long time, as diversity and inclusion's been kind of like a tidal wave. And, we're starting to see quite a bit of backlash here over the last year in the news cycle. And again, at a political level, but these are human conversations that we need to be having year round. And so it's really important that we talk about why this is important. I have some data to share with you on why this conversation needs to start earlier. What we talk about being an ally means is really showing support, modeling inclusive behavior. And then we'll give you some tangible ideas. And we'll have an opportunity again to participate with us. We'll save some time at the end. Just and encourage everybody to take one thing away from the conversation. And just so you know what to expect, for some of you, if you've been in the DEI space for a long time, this might feel like too little. If you're just new to the conversation, it might feel like too much. Our goal is to kind of strike a balance between those two extremes, somewhere in the middle, because most people are somewhere in the middle. We just don't know what we don't know. You probably heard about unconscious bias, but maybe you haven't attended a training or read about it. I'll explain more about some of the basics, but also go into some deeper dives into behaviors, action steps, some activities you can do as well with your kiddos. And then we're not going to tell you what to do. It would be lovely if I could wave a magic wand and say, leave this conversation and do this one thing. It's just not how this work works. It's nuanced. It's an ebb and flow. It's progress over perfection. So please just know, we're on a journey, hopefully together, and there's no destination, myself included. I'm going to keep doing this work and learning and unlearning over the course of my lifetime, as many of us are. So if we have actually a polling software that we'll be using, and it looks like my screen here we go. What we'd love to do is just get an idea of your knowledge level. And when we think about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, I'd love for you just to click on the link Catherine on my team just shared in the chat, or the directions are up at the top of the slide as well. If you could text, sorry, it's not sharing correctly. If you could text pivot point, you can also do that way, either the link or the text, either way. But ideally, rate your level of knowledge on diversity and inclusion right now. And I'll see if I can. I'm not sure what's happening with the display. Usually it works with Zoom, but I apologize. See, I don't know if I'll be able to get it to work live. That's okay. Maybe just pop in the chat if you're able to follow along there. Never had this happen before, so our apologies. We have a small enough group though. Just curious if you want to chat your responses, if you rated your level of knowledge on diversity and inclusion, 1 being I'm very new to the conversation, 10 being super advanced, maybe 5 being somewhere in between, how would you rate your level of understanding? And if you want privacy, the polling software we use is 100% anonymous, but you can also private message me in the chat if you want to participate that way too. So just kind of knowledge check, where are you on the conversation? It just helps me understand where to meet you where you're at. me just see. Just going to see real quick if that's a problem on our polling. Should work. Yeah, it looks like we're having just a little bit of an
Really,
issue.
I can read them to you. It's okay.
Okay. Okay.
I'm getting an average of 5, or the 5 average is 43%, 6 is 29%, 7 is 14%, and 8 is 14%. So 5 to 8.
Awesome. Awesome. Nice range there. Perfect. Thanks, Catherine. So that's kind of what I'm hearing is people are maybe in the conversation, have been having this conversation, but maybe we don't know what we don't know, myself included. But as I've been doing this work, what I've learned is that it's so important. I talk to a lot of adults, and for those of you who are adults and talk to adults, changing behavior gets a little more difficult as we age. Our brains kind of get more routinized in our thinking, more entrenched in our behaviors. I remember making a lot of adjustments in my earlier years, and now it's like I resist a little bit. And why this is important is because bias and how we learn about race, gender norms, all the stereotypes happens from a really young age. And so you all are around kids, and I'm sure you can see that happen. My 9-year-old, just turned 9 this week, educates me quite often on problematic behaviors that happen very early. It's really dangerous if we don't talk about them proactively. So just to level set, when we talk about diversity, we're talking kind of more about representation, and that goes beyond race and gender, but certainly those are big aspects of the conversation. Class, sexual orientation, ability, neurodiversity is a huge conversation right now. I'm sure you're seeing this as the rate of diagnosis and awareness has gone up tremendously over the years. But that's not enough. That's why the I is really about the inclusive behavior that creates a feeling, hopefully, of belonging if done well. And then equity is really about addressing systems that hold folks back. So when we think about equity, it's not the same as equality. Those two letters are a big difference. Equality is kind of like treating everybody the same, expecting a different outcome. Equality should be the output of equity. So the idea with equity is providing equitable access to things like our schools that are based on property taxes, and therefore, maintain classism and often racism because of how our communities are still very segregated. And then justice is ultimately the result we're all looking for from this work. So just kind of some level set definitions there. Maybe that's new. Maybe you have different perspectives on that. That's my perspective, not the only one. And then child development milestones. It's so interesting how early this starts. At 3 months, kids match. They learn race. And I know my white child, my 2-year-old, was really drawn to differences, faces that were different, as she, was born during the pandemic, so didn't have a lot of time outside of our home, which was obviously white faces. And when I'd spend time with my friends of color, really drawn to it because she saw it as different. So this whole idea that we don't see racial differences is very flawed. I was raised to be colorblind, which we now know to be, well-intentioned, but very problematic because we do see color. And unfortunately, we live in a world where people are treated differently based on their skin color, which is oftentimes something we can't control. It's an identity of which we're born into. And then this idea at 2.5, kids actually use this as a filter for deciding playmates. And then when you think about race at 4 to 5-year-olds, it's interesting, it's at its peak. And white children do show a preference, whereas Black and Latinx children, and Latinx isn't a perfect term, that's somewhat being, there's a both and to that term right now. It's not the preferred term. The reason the X is there to show gender neutrality, but the X does signal kind of an othering dimension. So I use Latinx just because I haven't learned of the proper placement term. If you all are familiar, please do let me know. But certainly Latina, Latino, those are gendered too. So yeah, we'd love input on that term if you have other ideas or have heard of other things there. So the idea here is that, again, white children kind of learn whiteness from a young age, whereas Black and brown children often have to assimilate to white environments and learn to kind of blend in. They learn the social norms as well. But representation really matters. It's fascinating. 2021, an organization called the Children's Book Cooperative actually goes through all of the available children's books and segments them by characters, by race and gender and LGBTQ. And you can see the statistics here. I'm just curious if anyone's surprised. I was astonished, when you add up Black, Asian, Brown, Latinx, just from a race perspective, there are more animals or objects as characters in these books than Black or Brown children total. And that's problematic because children need windows and they need mirrors. So windows that show themselves into other worlds and mirrors that reflect the world and their identity. And people like to say this number is getting better. We're still in single digits. So this is also a problem. And of course, the summer of 2020, there are a lot of books published, but they also have overt messages about race. It's Black is beautiful. These things are great positive messages. Children also, though, want to read a story, right? And so these overt messages, and in our children's book, The Little Allies, it's really intended to tell a playful story while also not sneaking in, but deliberately and intentionally plugging in dimensions of diversity, because kids still want an entertaining story, but they want to read about it in a way that's engaging. And so we need these windows and mirrors. And so when you think about mirrors, it's seeing yourself in the story. A window is seeing other vantage points in that story. So white children, and there's just a lot of, polarization around this topic with critical race theory and the 1619 Project right now. If you dive into that research and better understand it, it's not a shame and blame. It's really more about creating these windows because white children often live in very segregated societies where they don't have a lot of Black and Brown friends. Here in our school community, it's about 80% white. Now, of course, that changes in places like California, but we still don't have, if you think about racial representation of the whole, we're not mirroring that in our school systems. They're still very segregated, again, based on property taxes and socioeconomic class. And we know things like test scores are very highly correlated with class, therefore race. And so these problems just keep perpetuating and continuing. Here's another problem. Historical depictions of race, of LGBTQ have been really problematic. I mean, I remember watching Disney movies as a kid, and The Little Mermaid was one of my favorites. Well, think about the messages if you want to unpack those. Ursula was actually very intentionally developed. The villain was developed after a drag queen representation. Jafar in Aladdin is very gender non-binary and is a villain. And so if we continue to see villains as scary and depicting diverse representations, that's obviously problematic. And when you think about princesses, who gets to be a princess? How are the princesses depicted if they're not white? The Princess and the Frog movie was a big step in a somewhat right direction for Disney. But unfortunately, the character is a frog for most of the movie. So while Disney recognizes these films have a lot of racist challenges from our past, they acknowledge it to get better. And I'd point to movies like Encanto, and age dependent, of course, but Encanto does a really nice job. So does the other one's escaping me. We watch these endlessly in our home, and so I have them on full loop. Moana is the other one I was trying to think of. And not perfect films, but definitely better in the past. And thanks, Catherine, for sharing that resource in the chat. This is a drawing that my daughter actually drew at the time she was 6. And we had just gotten the Crayola multicultural crayons that, believe it or not, had just become available, like actual skin tone crayons had just become available in the summer of 2020. And, she was seeing things about, racial justice, and we were talking about it. And this is a drawing she drew as a white blonde girl asking a kid of color to be her friend. And you just kind of think like, wow, like what would the world look like if we saw things from a child's perspective, that diversity is additive and we didn't have to, make it so polarizing as we have often as adults. And if you're looking for content to help with a conversation, if you're struggling with this, I highly recommend Dr. Ibram Kendi's work. He has just published a new book too, How to Raise an Anti-Racist. So he's very well known for coining the term anti-racism or popularizing it. But he also wrote a book about how to raise anti-racist, which I found very, very compelling. And he has a young adult version actually for kids that if you're, many of you, that might be above your age range. But if you think about young adults that great book to buy for them that explains complex things in a very matter-of-fact, actionable, simplistic way. And I love what he says. It's not right or wrong. It's not right, my skin color, but it's not wrong. And I think that's the big difference is when we talk about racism with our kids, it's more just about it doesn't mean good or bad. It just means we shouldn't treat people differently based on their skin color. We shouldn't make different assumptions. We shouldn't place labels from a group onto an individual. So that's stereotyping, right? Which can lead to discrimination and then really terrible behavior if it's not checked. And so these things the more that we allow these behaviors to continue, the more charged, the more difficult the conversation gets, the worse the behavior gets. And exposure does help. And that's what people tell me, like, oh, I live in a very racially diverse area, my school system, et cetera. Yeah, those anomalies do exist. That's not the experience of most Americans. We do see that when we have a relationship and we have deepen contact, there is lower levels of prejudice. And prejudice just simply means, like the word says, to prejudge. Because we don't have as much anxiety if we've been around other racial groups or other gender identities or LGBTQ plus folks. This really transcends all aspects of diversity because representation matters. So if we see people reflected in our school system and teachers, right, is a great example too. Predominantly about 80% of US school teachers are white women. And so we have a real opportunity to increase that representation so that we're mirroring and matching the communities of which we hope to serve. And this is the challenge we're seeing right now is that, I don't think anyone comes out of the womb wanting to be exclusionary, right? I think we all want to be more inclusive. When we get out of the bed in the morning, we're probably not trying to think about how to be a big bully, right? It might feel that way or feel like other people are being that way. For the most part, we're social species. We're wired for connection. And Nelson Mandela, I think, sums it up great with this quote, we're not born hating another person because of the color of their skin, their background, their religion. We learn that hate. We can also learn love. And for love comes more naturally to the human heart than the opposite. So this is actually much more natural than the other way around. But we also feel fear. Our amygdalas in our brains are our fear centers, that fight or flight response. When we get triggered, we go to that fear button pretty quickly too. But love really is much more natural. And again, really love Dr. Ibram Kendi's work. There's 4 types of racial socialization that he points to in his book. And one's kind of like don't trust. So for me, this was going into a predominantly Black neighborhood as a child, and my mom saying to lock the doors, right? I got that message of, oh, we don't want trust, we don't feel safe. Cultural socialization, people will say, all fill in the blank, race or ethnicity. You can use either one of those terms or gender. Right? All women are this way. We're socialized actually to perpetuate these stereotypes and behaviors. And that's the preparation for bias. So that's what precurses the bias and the colorblindness narrative that I grew up with. Curious if anyone wants to share in the chat if you grew up with that what messages you heard about race as a child. I was told not to see it, to not talk about it. You see with disability, the shushing of someone in a wheelchair, rather than having a conversation about how did they get in that chair and how is it being in that chair, which most people, when you are curious and respectful, not judgmental, most people are very willing to talk about their lived experiences and differences. So this is how we socialize these stereotypes. And then what's really interesting about race is that, for Black Americans, it's not a conversation that they can't afford to have. I really love Procter and Gamble did a 3-part short video series. They just talk about, how Black people get the look, how Black parents have to have a conversation about policing with their children at a very young age. And for Asian American Pacific Islander, AAPI, we're seeing that continued in our news cycle and hate crimes. Same for the Jewish community. And this is affecting a lot of people, but white people don't really have to talk about it with their kids. Fortunately, we've had that conversation a lot in our household because of the work I do. But I find even the best of parents that I know and respect and appreciate don't talk about these things because they don't know how. And so if parents aren't able to talk about it, how can we in the after school world have the conversation to prepare the next generation, again, to not perpetuate the problems that were created by another generation? Because they can't afford, to keep having the same tired conversation. I hope my kiddos do not have the same tired conversation when they are adults. And that's why we need to have the conversation earlier. A lot of people like to say Gen Z, they're entering the workforce, they're going to change everything. And they really have limited power, limited resources. They have a lot of debt. It's going to be a challenge for them to change anything anytime soon. Yes, we need to start the conversation earlier, but we can't kick the can to them. We need to engage as adults too, because it's going to take time. We're talking about centuries of inequality can't be solved in a few years' time. And when we teach our real history, I love Dolly Chu's work. This is another great read, A More Just Future. It's her latest book. And it's really helpful because why we don't teach our history books were largely shaped post Civil War by the Confederacy. That was one of the gives that the North gave to the South. Well, when you write history from one perspective, that's problematic. And unfortunately, race is it's not mentioned hardly at all in our history books still today. It's kind of that narrative of we had slavery, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, civil rights happened, we're all good. We fast forward through lynching, Jim Crow, Reconstruction that was actually pretty successful until the backlash occurred with it after a decade. We had representation of previous folks that had been enslaved in government positions with real power until that backlash occurred. Sundown laws. I could go on and on about all the things that happened that we didn't learn about in our history books. And why is that? Because if we don't think anything happened, then there's no problem to be solved. If we do hear that something happened, but get over it, that happened 50 years ago, or people love to say 150 years ago, slavery was in our country for 250 years, so much longer here than it hasn't been here. But if we learn that terrible things happened and we own it, not from a blame and shame perspective, but just own the fact that these bad things happened, it's a reality, then we're actually better equipped to solve the problem because we fully understand it was a problem. And I love this Bob Marley hypothesis as a term used in the psychology world, is the ignorance of racism in the past leads to denial of racism in the present, right? And so you can understand how this makes it really challenging to solve problems if we don't believe they exist. And that's what we're seeing, alive and well in a polarized news cycle and political realm. So Gen Z, again, we're not kicking the can to them, but if you look at racial representation, they are the most ethnically and racially diverse group. And so race is about skin color, ethnicity is about your country of origin or where you call home. And so what we're starting to see is, right, like certainly biracial and multiracial is very much growing. And we're seeing here, this is what one of the challenges is that we're seeing just this whole idea of race and gender really being fluid, non-binary. And so it's less about black and white or brown. It's much more about all of us together. And so when we see a shrinking white population for older white Americans, it can be very scary. We know that a lot of the backlash right now is based off of these demographics and forecasts that white will not be the majority race by the year, I believe it's 2042. It's definitely in the 2040s. It's not far away. But what if we embrace that as a real opportunity to leverage the diverse strengths that all people bring with all diverse backgrounds? You're just looking at it a little bit differently. So the conversation's just starting. It's not going away based on those demographics. That's why we need to embrace color bravery versus color blindness. I really appreciate, that what color blindness was trying to do in the 1980s was say, hey, civil rights happen, affirmative action happen. We're creating a level playing field. Let's stop talking about it and just let people be their full human selves. Totally get it. But as we continued to deny that race was a thing, and we certainly didn't talk about it, and if we did talk about it, it was very taboo. It was definitely not something white people were encouraged to do. I remember several awkward, I'm sure harmful conversations for folks of color that I was privy to as a child, trying not to talk about it or trying to say, oh, you're like us, right? Meaning that whiteness was good and otherness was bad. And so all of these problems, if we don't see them, we can't solve them. And so that's where we're migrating to, is how do we be brave in these conversations? And it's about modeling, for our kids, how we manage conflict. Do we do that in front of our kids? How we listen or not listen? How we apologize and show accountability for inappropriate behavior? How do we show frustration? How do we ask for help? How do we approach differences? Who do you invite into your home, right? How do you model inclusion for the kids that you're spending time with after school? And these are just some fun facts. Not having a 9-year-old is not fun for me. But did you know, girls' confidence peaks at age 8? Why is that? Gender socialization really starts to take on its peak then. Right, so there's a lot of studies that show it's gendered behaviors are learned. They're not innate. There's not a biological, yes, we have different bodies, we have different hormones. It doesn't affect our ability to do math or science or solve problems or be empathetic. Girls are taught to be pleasing. Boys are taught to be leaders. Same behavior, different words, bossy, leader. Why do they mean different things when they're in different packages? So girls learn to be small, to minimize themselves, to hedge, to be less than. And that's harmful for all people. Another, did you know, our racial views largely solidified by age 12. And so you have a really important window. At age 10, kids' critical thinking skills really are much more robust to have complex conversations. At 9, my daughter and I can talk about critical things, but she still says to me, racism doesn't make sense, Mom. Like, yeah. And I'm not trying to justify it by any means. I'm just trying to explain how we got here. And it literally does not make sense to her. Right. But ages 10, 11, 12, you can start to shape those views before, unfortunately, that bias is pretty well baked. And then what we did with Little Allies, our children's book, is really designed to be an interactive storytelling. So we use little vignettes or little short stories. And one of the short stories is based on a real story that my podcast co-host Simone shared with me many years ago. Her daughter was 3 at the time at preschool, and a white boy, she's Black, and a white boy was chasing her around the playground, telling her she didn't belong. That's something real that happens, unfortunately, kids of color at an alarming rate. And that's not the first time, and that's not the last time that's happened to her daughter. And so it's really, I think we can all be better. As that story illustrates, it's just really problematic and very disappointing, but unfortunately a sad reality. And so thinking about your why, I gave you a bunch of data, a bunch of examples. I'm just kind of curious to check in with everybody. Why do you think talking to kids might be important? And I'll just keep on this screen. Catherine, I don't know if you see them in the polling or if you want to share it in the chat, but I'd love to hear everybody's why at this point, kind of a reflection question just to think on. It could be kind of that learned behavior, child's developmental cycle, I think is just fascinating. And I know y'all, that's your world, so you probably know it even better, but you can click on the link and share or chime in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share too. Lots of ways to participate. Any thoughts on why? What is something you're learning, something that's moving for you?
Julie, one comment that came in is just that I'd like personally to learn from them, their perspective. So,
Yeah. It's when you open up your ears and listen, it's fascinating what you learn. And I think the other thing is just we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as adults to like be perfect, have the answers. And, when you're just vulnerable and real, kids can sniff it out. They're very authentic. They're very dialed into that. So how can you, really listen to learn versus imparting? Because I certainly don't have this figured out like any of us do. It's really a learning in progress. Okay, we'll continue to share those whys. Love to hear from folks. And then what? So you're probably thinking, okay, Julie, this is great, but like, what does it mean to be what we call a little ally? And the word ally takes on a lot of forms. Most importantly, it's an action. So it's not a sit on the sidelines, read my book, do a protest or social media post and, put a black square and be done. It's really over time. It's consistent, intentional actions. And so when we talk about it from a younger person perspective, it could be being a friend to someone different from you, a supporter of someone different from you, an amplifier. I think it's great at our children's museum here in Indiana, where I live. We have the stories of Malala, Ruby Bridges, I believe his name's Ryan White. I was just there the other day, and it's like really inspiring. And then my kids can learn to be supporters, right? Amplifiers of other kids' messages that have, went through hardships, but learned to be advocates. Because not everybody wants to be an advocate, but that's certainly an approach. And being a listener, so much is when people are going through hard things, racism, sexism, these isms, I feel othered, they feel less than. And so one of the best things we can do is validate the lived experiences of others and listen to learn from their experience versus judge, which is a subtle but really powerful feeling that creates that sense of belonging. Not everybody's wired for this. Y'all said at the beginning, you're somewhere in the middle. Most people are curious. There are some folks, about 20% of the last attitudinal poll on this in the United States, 20% were like anti-diversity. And unfortunately, those loud voices are often heard, even though there's such a small percentage of our population. And then we're at kind of a critical mass perspective with allyship, where about a third of our population is engaged in the conversation. And just a reminder, I don't think we want to write anybody off or cancel anybody. If they show bad behavior, it's an opportunity to learn. If they're unwilling to learn, that's a different conversation about accountability. But if we have some space and grace for people, they usually want to join the conversation rather than refrain from it. It's often when we're canceled or others that people retreat. And then think about, non-binary from a gender perspective. Again, Gen Z overwhelmingly, identifies as a much higher rate than past generations because it's been, the awareness and acceptance has increased vastly in their lifetime. So one of the stories we have in the Little Allies is about Sam, and Sam doesn't exclusively identify as male or female. And this kind of raises eyebrows for kiddos, like, wait, what? So if a gym teacher, for example, lines up boys and girls in two lines, a person like Sam would not know which line to go to. And gender is not binary. It's not just male or female, girl or boy, even though our brains like to categorize and put one or the other. It's often a spectrum. And so what someone could do is say, hey, I'm going to line you up by birth month, right? We kind of use these default stereotypes or old gender norms as defaults when it's really not that difficult to pick other categories to organize children by. We just kind of defaulted to that, complacent thinking, unfortunately. So when you think about being a little ally or being an ally, I'd love for folks to share. And again, you can click on the link and share. You can share in the chat. But if you had to summarize it, what would be your definition? How would you go talk with someone about this topic? What would you explain what allyship means? It was interesting. The word allyship was actually the dictionary.com, like the word of the year in 2021. So clearly a lot of people are like Googling it and curious about it, but people still don't know what it means. So I define it, and I purposely don't put this on a slide because I don't want to. I think it's your own term. You co-create your own definition. But for me, it's supporting somebody different from myself, right? And that could be racially, that could be gender, that could be LGBTQ, that could be disability, age. It's just supporting them, like, so they don't feel alone. And that could be in the form of advocacy. That could be in the form of listening, empathizing. That could be in the form of amplifying. There's lots of verbs, keyword and verb, to show action, but kind of curious what allyship means to you.
Julie, can you go to the next slide to activate that question?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
We'll see if it pops up. It looked like it popped up last time. It's just kind of going to a different screen. Love technology when it works. Feel free to chat your responses, or again, if anyone wants to unmute and share live, feel free.
I'll share a little bit from my perspective.
Okay. Malia.
Yeah. So what I'm learning now about allyship is like really recognizing like my own privilege and learning from others' perspectives like authentically and being able to honor that piece. I think that's where allyship has gotten a lot deeper for me and is helping me move forward even more, right? Because you can support folks from your own perspective and your own kind of privileged lens, but it's another thing to really understand someone else's experience and getting curious and then supporting that instead of my interpretation of that, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that's just kind of where I'm at in my journey. Is really getting curious and trying to understand.
I love that. Yeah. Curiosity is one of the biggest things you can do. And it's actually, that's what we can learn from kids because they are curious, right? They ask weird questions that like we filter as adults. Like we think it, like we have someone on our team that's a wheelchair user, right? And he says, he's like, I love it when kids come up to me because they're not mean about it. They're just like, what happened? Like, I'm wondering that, but I'm not going to ask him that, right? Because I don't want to embarrass him. I don't want to look silly. I don't want to be unkind. So what do I do instead? Is I just like pretend like nothing's different. Like that doesn't feel right either. So if you just show genuine curiosity, you can really go, it goes a long way. And it sounds simple, but it's a mindset. Like I go into conversations like, okay, what am I going to teach somebody? No, like it's not about what I'm going to share. It's about what am I going to learn from the other person. And that's how you build those empathy bridges. Like your story was perfectly explained that. Thank you. I see another one here, giving young people tools and talk tracks. Yes. Yeah, I think that's the talk track piece, just like we're kind of modeling. I'm going to go through that here in a minute. One of my favorite ally phrases with young people is just, I wonder. I wonder. I wonder about that. Right. And that's a great one for after you read a book or do an activity. I wonder what y'all thought about that. Like so easy to ask. But we don't ask those curious questions enough. We don't leave space for ambiguity because we're afraid what I'm gonna say. And I've done it enough. I mean, you all spend a lot more time with young people than I get to, but we actually just launched our nonprofit, the Little Allies. And so we're hoping to do more of this work and partnering with organizations like yours, bring tools, information, a lot of times what people need is like what to say, what to do. Because if you don't have structure, then you get fearful real quick or like, oh gosh, what if the parents ask? Like, I totally get it as somebody that has bumbled and stumbled myself. That is part of the journey, though, is just that vulnerability. Cool. Well, anybody else thoughts on what allyship means? We're gonna get into some of the how-to here. Yeah, I hear somebody. Did you want to share? Being a safe place for discussion. Yeah. Hey, Liz, I see you unmuted. Did you want to share? Oh, okay, maybe not. All right.
Yeah, Julie, that full question is being someone that others look to as a safe space to discuss topics that might make them feel uncomfortable or just to discuss everyday life.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, that space creating. And I think that's sounds kind of abstract is how do we create space? But if you get people sharing hard things with you, you're probably creating space, right? If people come to you, we interviewed someone on our Inclusion School podcast, and he is gay and a school counselor. And he said the kids, when they were coming out, often came to him first as that safe place, right? Because he's demonstrated the lived experience, but signaled that you're somebody, and oftentimes before they even told their parents, right? And so what a honor if you create that space and model it, that people give you that real sincere experience. It's life-changing. I mean, it's really powerful when you think about it. Love that. Thanks, Catherine. So some of the how-tos, and these are some talk tracks. Again, we have the Allyship in Action. We'll share some tools that we have. And again, it's for our nonprofit. So this isn't something we're trying to monetize per se, but we do want to create more of an intentional impact. We have a workbook with these activities, but these are just some of the high level phrasing that I would recommend without having to read anything or do any more work. One is vulnerability. So this is admitting mistakes, weaknesses, getting comfortable saying, I don't know. I really detest this one, especially with my kids, because I feel like I'm supposed to know everything. And they ask some doozies, and, we could fib and fumble our way through, but they know that we're fibbing and fumbling. Just be honest. I don't know. Model it's okay to feel uncomfortable. It's okay. It's like, oh, that's a tough one. I know sometimes when we watch films, like Hidden Figures is a great film, not perfect. There's a white saviorism problem with it. But overall, it's about the hidden stories of Black women at NASA. And it was really powerful to watch with my kiddo and be like, why do you think that we are just learning about this now? Right. I wonder. And if they say something about like that doesn't feel right, like, yeah, honor that. Right? That doesn't feel right to me either. So it's okay to not know. And I really love when I don't know something is like, let's Google it together. Let's get out our phone, like let's get out a tool, a resource, and figure it out together. Right? We don't have to have all the answers. Empathy is a huge ally vehicle. Taking on the perspective of others, creating those spaces, just like that great comment that was shared earlier, for others to feel that sense of belonging. And I love one of my favorite empathy phrases. It's not just like, oh my gosh, I know exactly how that feels, or that happened to me too. it's less about me and my ego and my story, and it's more about them. I'm glad you shared that with me. I'm sorry you feel that way. That sounds hard. Okay? And so that phrasing keeps the focus on the other person, not deflect back on you. And this is something that's really powerful, especially with loss or death, is people just want to grieve. They just want to feel heard. And when I lost my mom at a young age, I remember a lot of people telling me, like, I lost my parent too. And, they're like much older and like a very different perspective. And I remember the most helpful feedback was like, oh my gosh, I feel for you, right? I want you to know that I'm here for you. Though the people that said that made me feel just so much better. And so when someone shares something hard, just remind yourself, you don't have to have the answers. You don't have to be perfect. And just say, I'm glad you shared that with me. This is a fun exercise to do at home. This is called the Bechtel test, if anyone's familiar with this. So it's 3 questions. 1, are there women as main characters in the movie? Which is like 50% of films still don't have female main characters, which is like really unfortunate because that's obviously a big part of people that watch films. But even if they do, they don't have women that talk to each other. And then a step further, do they talk about anything other than men? You would be horrified to know the amount of movies that do not pass these 3 questions, right? So yeah, we have women in the movie, but they don't talk to each other. And if they do talk to each other, they only talk about men. More movies than not fail this test. Still today, 2023, I know it is shameful. And really just, think about all the missed opportunities to connect with audiences. So the reason I share that is like, this is a candid conversation. We talk about comfort with discomfort. You're not going to do this perfectly. But one of the things we can all do better is call out problematic behaviors. If you see something, say something, call people in, say, hey, I heard you say that. What makes you say that? Right? Help me understand where you're coming from. Right? I'd love to know more about what you said there. And then you can say, hey, I really have a different perspective, or that really misses, for me, that's missing this, or I wish you would have said it this way. Right? So you can have these little short conversations calling people in. I remember, a lot of people saying strange things about racism in the summer of 2020. Like, I just don't see it. Or like, is this really that big of a deal? And it's like, I just remember telling them, like, rather than say like, that's racist, shame on you. Doesn't usually go well. It was instead like, hey, I used to think that too. Or, hey, yeah, I know what you mean. I've heard that before. And here's what I've come to understand. Right. And so you're acknowledging, but you're also not letting somebody get off the hook with a problematic statement. Because you imagine if somebody says that to somebody that's experienced harmful racism, how othering and how non-welcome they would probably feel around that person. And that's often what we're dealing with, are these like microaggressions, these micro behaviors, these small but subtle, non-inclusive acts that signal to folks that they don't belong. And then curiosity, we talked about this at length. Valley, your story was great about that. Kids are naturally curious. They appreciate, they see differences. One of the stories we feature in the book is, again, based off a real life story that someone shared with us on our Inclusion School podcast. And it was about a child who English is their second language and Spanish is their first language. And oftentimes the child would play by themselves and write Spanish words and not socialize with the other kids because there was a language barrier. And so what would happen if a child sat with them and learned some of the words of their language, right? And taught them some of their language. So there's reciprocal sharing there. There's a value add created there. There's an exchange, and it's not us having to learn a different language, it's us together learning different languages. It's just so powerful, especially since younger minds are more capable of learning other languages more quickly. I didn't learn another language till 8th grade, which was really late. And that's also kind of an American thing. And so just think about 2 words that will totally change conversations that you have, what and how. What do you think? How did we get here? How does that fit? right? How would that work? What's the difference, right? What happened? The key with those words is you can't answer that with a simple yes or no or one word answer, as you know, sometimes kids, especially into the teenage years, like to do. Just get out of here. So, what do you think? Right? I wonder those phrases. I love. One of the things I try to do with my 9-year-old, and I'm by no means perfect here, but we try to, model curiosity and say, hey, or she shares something with me like, are you looking for me to give you the answer or are you wanting me to listen right now? And more times than not, she just said, Mom, I just want you to listen. I don't need you to have the answer. And it's such a relief for me. And I'm sure for her, because I'm going to an advice mode and she's just not interested. And then the seeking to understand versus to be understood. We also want to meet our kids where they're at, that I wonder, help me understand, I'm curious about. Be intentional and consistent over time. So this isn't a one and done conversation. I wish it could be, but it's much more complex than that. Could we bring this up once a month? We have a topic. A wonderful excuse is cultural celebrations. Obviously we're in Black History Month, should celebrate it all year. We have Women's History Month next month. We have Celebrate Diversity Month in April. We have Pride Month in June. We have Disability Awareness Month in October. And there's many, many more cultural celebrations. We have a calendar on our website you can download as well. And think about your bookshelf, your media that you consume, the media you choose to use with children. What I knew is my bookshelf when I first started this work, my bookshelf was just like that, awful report I shared with you earlier. Is mostly white characters and animals. I really didn't have a lot of diverse books on my bookshelf, and that since has changed. And the movies we watch, right? Making sure that there's, racial representation, that there's not gendered stereotypes, because it's harmful to kids and they're absorbing those messages and learning what's acceptable and not acceptable just by way of the media. Oh, thanks, Catherine, for sharing that in the chat. Y'all can download that calendar. It's a starting point. It's not, we're always adding to it too if you have other celebrations to add. One of the things I learned this year is I had grown up with a Chinese American friend that moved here when she was 5 from Shanghai. And we had celebrated Chinese New Year. And I knew that's how she celebrated it. So we posted a meme in January about Chinese New Year. Well, come to find out, it's Lunar New Year, and it's much more vast across a lot of different cultures, not just Chinese that celebrate it. So just sharing that because we're learning all the time too. Thanks, Veronica. Awesome questions. And you can ask us anything. So if you've been using the polling, you can just click on that link and ask us anything. It's, again, 100% anonymous, and we'll answer as many questions as we possibly have. Kind of getting towards the end of the content I prepared. So if you have questions, by all means, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah. And we're always looking for feedback. So if you have other feedback, that is something that we're working on. And I think that's just one of the cautions of doing this work is if we try to do it perfectly, you're going to be too cautious. If you, really don't do any research and just show up unprepared, it's not going to go well either. There's definitely a striking point somewhere in between where it can feel natural, not rehearsed. I will say you develop some muscle memory doing this work. The first time I talked about privilege 6-7 years ago, really uncomfortable. You get sweaty and nervous. Like, oh God, people are going to hate me. I feel uncomfortable. I'm not a bad privileged person. And then now that I talk about it so much, it really doesn't faze me at all. I actually probably say it too much. So it's just, I say that to say, like, we can learn these behaviors. It's just, we got to unpack, the narratives that we carry from our childhood experiences. A lot of this is programmed from a young age. And so for all of us working with children, what an opportunity to disrupt these systems that unfortunately perpetuate inequality. There's a reason. This is one of the activities in our workbook, our Allyship in Action workbooks. We have an adult book and workbook that goes with it, one of the activities we have is draw kids, and this works at any age, have them just draw a picture of a leader. 80% of the time kids draw an old white man, right? Because look around, that's what they see. That's who they see in politics. That's who they see in companies, CEOs. They learn that from a young age. And so the message girls get is I can't be a CEO, or maybe I don't want to be a CEO, right? Because that's not me and I'm not like that. Kids of color, same, like there's not opportunities for me to do that. That's for those people. And so just being careful, it's a great activity to just talk about stereotypes and how our brain naturally defaults to what it absorbs through our lived experiences. Okay, well, if anybody has a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. I just wanted to kind of wrap up with a story. Again, all the stories that we wrote about in our Little Allies book, and now starting our nonprofit about allyship and having these conversations at a young age. Our purpose is really to facilitate inclusive experiences so that all kids feel seen, they feel heard, they feel a sense of belonging in all the spaces they are. Certainly our schools and our after school programs should be places that they feel a sense of belonging. But unfortunately, when we are collecting data and experiences to showcase in our book, what we found is that a lot of kids recognize from a young age, I'm not like them, right? One of the stories that I heard was like about ethnic food was very common for first generation Americans or children of first generation Americans that, take a lot of pride in their cultural, their ethnic foods, and bringing their foods to school, and kids being like, oh, that's gross or that stinks. And just learning very quickly, like, okay, I got to eat like peanut butter and jelly or, whatever the normal, quote unquote, and that's a word we probably need to strike from our vocabulary, because what is normal, right? There really is no normal. And so that was something that was just heartbreaking for me to hear. So how could we instead say, oh, I'm curious, right? Oh, your food's different. I'd love to learn more about it. What's it called? What does it taste like? Why do you like it, right? And if we did that as adults, imagine how much kids could learn from that. And we get to meet kids where they're at. So absolutely the conversation needs to be age appropriate. Before 5, it's pretty challenging, right? And then before 12, it's critically important. And that age 10, we know to be kind of a peak opportunity to talk more critically about things. But I just like to share these facts. The racial wealth gap is 10 times higher for Black people. Okay, so on average, the inheritance, like the accumulated historical intergenerational wealth, is one of the biggest systemic problems facing race here. I mentioned a bunch of these earlier, but a lot of times we just learn about slavery and civil rights in history classes. What about sharecropping, which was kind of like slavery 2.0? What about Jim Crow? What about redlining? What about standardized testing? What about mass incarceration rates? It's a great documentary, 13th, that talks about what happened after the 13th Amendment to present day and how prisons are kind of a modern form of slavery. Tax laws, predatory lending. So lots of really good, unfortunate, but helpful content to paint a bigger picture, right? Because if we just learn this limited version of the truth, it becomes really easy to deny that there's a problem. So I talked about vulnerability. I talked about empathy, curiosity, how to have a candid conversation. We talked about the Bechtel tool. We talked about, some of those key phrases. I'd love to hear what's resonating with you all. If there were tools, ideas, some of these talk tracks. One of the ones that has been most popular in these talks that we've given is the whole, I wonder. So easy just to replace, a do, could, should, would, yes or no question with a, I wonder. And maybe just mentally pause, to say that out loud before. A lot of times just go into like instant react mode. And this helps with, disagreements between people, between kids. Like, I wonder what their perspective was. If you have a kid, the he said, she said game, right? Hey, I wonder what their perspective could have been, right? If it's a different perspective, how could we look at those differences? So tools or ideas that are resonating. And again, if anybody wants to share live, you're more than welcome to do so.
I can share one.
Please, hey Aaron.
How's it going? I think one that I definitely um want to start using is being okay with I don't know. Um, that response of just you realize you don't know, not trying to pick up something on the spot because you worry when you're in a position of leadership and you feel like you have to know some of these answers, but the reality is I know very little about many of the topics that were put on today, and so it's okay with saying I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. What do you know? Right. I mean, a lot of times we can kind of deflect, buy ourselves some time. I heard a really great explanation of confidence versus arrogance recently. And confidence is like, I know what I know and I don't know. I know what I don't know. Arrogance is like, I know everything. Right. And you met the arrogant person, and isn't it like so off-putting? Like, I don't even want to be around that person, let alone share anything that might be helpful to that person. Versus confidence is like, yeah, I don't know everything. Yeah, co-researching. I think that let's look it up together. Let's figure this out together. You know what? I don't know. Let's talk about it. And what that models for kids is I don't have all the answers, right? I get to be heard. I get to be listened to. My perspective matters. And when you co-create, you have a deeper commitment, right? It's like, I remember I had a hamster when I was a kid, and my mom always wanted to clean the cage, and I never saw a need to clean this cage, even though it stunk terribly. And I remember her asking me to clean the cage and be like, no, or I'd like, wait till the last minute. But if I decided to clean the cage, my level of commitment was much higher, right? And she would just ask, hey, Julie, how do you think the hamster's doing? And so then I would like, oh, food. Oh, yeah, it is kind of dirty. And then I decided different than when she's like, you clean the cage or else, right? It's just a totally different level of commitment. And so if we just spend a little bit of time co-creating with folks, co-researching with folks, they're going to have a deeper ingrained, behavior and commitment to it. So it saves you a lot of time. It feels like a lot of time in the short term when you're like, go, go, go. It saves you like so much long term. Good stuff. Anybody else? I think the last thing I just wanted to wrap up with is I love this phrase. I borrowed this from someone I follow on social media. It's like, read books, don't ban books. We're in a weird place right now where these book bans, it cracks me up. Like, why are people, I legitimately am curious, like, what about this book is creating so much fear for you? Like, I am really concerned. But that's just one example of something we can take action on, is advocating for diversity on our bookshelves, right? Our local libraries. It's Black History Month. I went in and I was like, it's Black History Month. What do you got? They don't have a dang display. Like, shame on them. Like, I didn't say that. We should not lead with shame. But I was like, really? That seems like a miss. That's all I said. We can do that in our schools too. The influence that we have on educators in our community, I just think is so, so important. And these are a few books that we mentioned. Two for adults. So More Just Future. Dolly Chu is just a fantastic human being. Love her work. She makes it so practical too. And she tells stories, which I think is just so helpful. And Dr. Ibram Kendi's work, you've probably heard of him with anti-racism, but a lot of people don't know he wrote a word book for little kids, wrote a young adult book that I would say, I mean, my daughter's 9 and starting to read chapter books. I would say maybe 10, 11, 12 is probably as early as that one goes. I think he designed it for teenagers though, but there's an adult one that a lot of the content, a lot of the ideas I shared with you today are represented here. And then I love Last Stop on Mark History. It's all about different cultures as people get off the bus. And it's just very cool. It's an entertaining book that happens to layer in diversity. And that's probably what we need to look for more, is like, how do we have a good story that also incorporates diversity without these overt messages? Yes, those messages are important, but when we title them and position them away, that does usually cause like a backlash or kids just not being as interested too. So we need all types of books. I think just weaving in the story is really helpful too. So I'd love to hear, 2 things from you. One, you rated your level of knowledge at the beginning, curious. what shifted for you. If you were able to increase your knowledge, I'll give you kind of a minute or so to respond there. And then the other question I have for you, before we just wrap up with questions, is, think about your commitment. What's one thing you can do as a result of what you're learning today? I mean, obviously, hopefully attended some other workshops. If there's something else resonating for you, feel free to share. But I'd love to hear, from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, what you're taking away from the conversation as well. So rate your level of knowledge. I'm sure, Catherine, that's showing up somewhere. And feel free to put your level of knowledge there. And then the last question I'll ask you is just one thing you'll do with what you learned. So one thing you can do as a result of what you've learned today. And I loved, Erin, you shared just the importance of saying, I don't know. And like, isn't that freeing? I love it when I'm like, oh, good, I don't have to know everything. And I get asked some doozies. I mean, people have to ask me, this is one example. Have I read like so-and-so's book on this? I can tell you I read a lot, and I have books, 2 huge bookshelves filled with books here. I have not read everything about diversity and inclusion. I don't have enough time. And quite frankly, I probably need to be reading a lot of different things, not just about that one subject. So I usually say, no, I haven't. You tell me about it. And I think sometimes people are like, what? She hasn't read this. This is my favorite. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of great, thankfully, there's a lot of content out there. So you don't have to have all the answers. Just kind of wait and see. If you have something that's resonating, something you're taking away from the conversation, something you can take action on, feel free to put that in the chat. And Catherine shared the link again in the chat if anyone missed it. Yeah, the Bechtel test is a good one. It's sadly not used. I mean, and I don't mean to be facetious laughing. It's just like, it is startling how many. I remember when I first saw the movie Captain Marvel, I think it was Captain Marvel. I don't really watch a lot of those movies, but there was a female protagonist. I was like, oh, wow. And she had a best friend who was a Black woman, and they talked to each other and had a positive relationship. I mean, that was the first time I'd ever seen that in a movie. And that was like 5 years ago. Wonder Woman, same thing. I mean, I had never seen a movie like that. And that's very recent in our filmmaking history. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of films that don't have gender, let alone racial representation. There's actually a blacklist in Hollywood that was very much movies that were not allowed to be made because they would not appeal to the white majority. And someone took that list and started producing the films, and it's actually wildly successful. So it's just interesting, and think about that connotation too. Black is usually used as a negative, which is very triggering for folks. Luffy, I really enjoy role modeling to students and even adults how to empathize with others. The true meaning of listening is so frustrating when people like to pop. Yeah, that reminds me of what happened to me. Yeah, that's not what people want when they share something hard with you. Yeah, give kids more of a shared experience. Yeah, I might have missed the edge on that one.
Yeah, it says give kids more of an opportunity to share their experiences.
Cool. Yes. Yes. That's perfect. Yes. Thank you for doing that. Awesome. The last thing I'll leave everybody with is feel free, to jot down our contact info. TheLittleAllies.com. We've got the children's book and actually some allyship toolkits as well. So I mentioned the workbook has like 25 different activities you can do, like the draw leader exercises in there. There's an empathy exercise, there's a vulnerability exercise, there's a curiosity exercise. So all the things we talked about today, if you like that, it gives you the content to literally like say this. We had a retired teacher design, we wrote the content and then she designed it in a way that would resonate with educators. So we have done our due diligence there. And just message me, if this resonates with you, or, it'd be helpful to share some of these tools, just shoot me a note. I always respond to my email, usually same day. And then if you're on Instagram, we post pretty regularly. In our Inclusion School podcast, we're also on Instagram there, just Inclusion School is our handle there. And thanks, Catherine, for sharing the link. Either one of those, you can get more content and more education. I'll pause here. I mean, that's all the content I had prepared for you all today. Questions, thoughts? Happy to stick around if there's other questions we didn't get to. And I don't see anybody else stick around. Malia, I don't know if you had anything in closing you needed to share. I know people got a little grace in the next session, it sounds like. Really enjoyed being with y'all today.
Thank you so much, Julie. This was amazing. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I was clicking on all the links and jotting down all these notes as a mother and as someone who supports youth. This is just invaluable and such good reminders. So thank you so much. If you all don't have any questions or don't want to stick around or don't need to, we're having a break right now. So break is, let me pull it up. It starts at 11:30 for most people, but let me see. The next session I believe is at 11:45, but I'm double checking. Bear with me, y'all. Yes. So 11:45 is the next session. The Zoom link should be in the app. And I'll stick around for a little bit in case you have any questions when it comes to any of these virtual sessions as well.
Thanks, y'all. Enjoy your break. Thanks for the support.